He saw his pregnant ex-wife working as a waitress at his own wedding. What happened next shattered lives, exposed shocking betrayals, and changed everything he thought he knew about love, legacy, and family. This isn't just a story, it's a storm of secrets, sacrifice, and a fight for redemption you won't forget. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And don't forget to subscribe to hear the full story and more unforgettable journeys like this one. Sure, here's part 1 of the story based on the outline and inspiration, written in American English, seamless and exactly 1,500 words. You may now kiss the bride. The words echoed through the opulent grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, floating in the air like a benediction. The crowd leaned forward with expectant smiles, crystal flutes of champagne in hand, camera phones discreetly raised. But Ethan Blake, heir to the multi-billion-dollar Blake capital fortune, golden boy of the Manhattan elite, did not move. His breath caught in his chest, because across the room, near the edge of the gold-accented marble floor, framed between a towering floral arrangement and a catering table, stood the ghost of the life he thought he'd buried. Jasmine. Her name slammed into his heart with the force of a freight train, unspoken but thunderous. She stood still, frozen like a photograph in motion, dressed in a simple black server's uniform that did little to disguise the very real, very unmistakable curve of her belly. She clutched a silver tray lined with champagne glasses, her knuckles white as she held it steady, though her entire body seemed ready to collapse. Their eyes locked across the distance, and time halted. Ethan's entire world tipped on its axis. He hadn't seen her in over 7 months. Not since the day she walked out of their brownstone with tears in her eyes and divorce papers in her purse. Not since they stood in silence across from one another in that sterile lawyer's office, signing away a love that had once felt invincible. And certainly not since she had vanished from Manhattan like a memory scrubbed from the skyline. And now she was here, pregnant. The weight of that single fact suffocated him like a heavy wool blanket, his lungs forgetting how to draw in breath. His chest tightened. "Ethan?" Sabrina's voice came from beside him, light and sweet, touched with concern. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer, couldn't. He took a step back from the altar, his polished shoes thudding against the marble with shocking finality. Murmurs started to ripple through the crowd like the first gust of a storm. Sabrina touched his arm lightly. "Ethan, are you—" She's pregnant," he said hoarsely. The words came out broken and cracked, jagged things. That's Jasmine." The tray Jasmine had been holding clattered onto the catering table beside her, a glass toppling over but miraculously not shattering. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, as if to shield it from what came next. The crowd turned, whispers built, faces twisted in confusion, curiosity, shock. Ethan took a step forward, then another. He didn't care that he was abandoning his new bride at the altar. He didn't care that cameras were flashing or that Senator Caldwell, Sabrina's father, had risen from his chair already brimming with embarrassment and rage. He didn't care about the $80 million his mother and Victor had poured into making this the wedding of the year, or the gossip columnists ready to explode with headlines. All he cared about was Jasmine, and the child that should not, could not exist. By the time he reached her, Jasmine was trembling. She held her chin high, but her lips were tight, her eyes wet. She looked at him like he was both salvation and betrayal incarnate. "Say something," she whispered, her voice shaking. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. He was the only question his mind could form. How was she pregnant after years of failed fertility treatments? After months of tears and hormones and tests that always came back inconclusive, or worse? After they'd been told, by experts, by specialists, by hope itself, that they would never have a child? Is it? His throat closed again. Jasmine nodded slowly, her expression taut with something between grief and defiance. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible over the murmurs. "She's yours." Jasmine's lips curved into a trembling, broken smile. "A girl, due in 6 weeks." And with that, the ballroom detonated into chaos. Sabrina let out a choked sound behind him. Shock? Rage? Humiliation? Ethan didn't turn to see. Camera flashes strobed like lightning. The officiant stood frozen, awkwardly holding a gold-leaf Bible, forgotten mid-blessing. A groomsman dropped his champagne flute, the crash echoing like punctuation to a social catastrophe in motion. Victor Blake was the first to recover. He strode across the marble floor like a general surveying a mutiny, his salt and pepper hair perfectly slicked back, his custom tux immaculate as always, but there was fire in his eyes. "Ethan," he said through clenched teeth, "get back to the altar. We can fix this." "There's nothing to fix," Ethan said quietly, still looking at Jasmine. This changes everything." Victor's mouth twitched. "You don't know what she's playing at. You can't possibly believe." "I know she wouldn't lie about this," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "Not her, not Jasmine." Jasmine's eyes flashed. "Your stepfather knows exactly how this happened. Maybe you should ask him what he signed off on when he generously offered to cover our fertility bills." Victor's face went stone cold. Ethan stared at Jasmine, stunned. "What are you saying?" She didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she brushed past him, heading for the exit. But just before she reached the doors, she turned back, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "If you want the truth, Ethan, really want it, come find me." Then she disappeared into the hallway, the silence behind her deafening. The reporters surged forward, the wedding planner fainted, Senator Caldwell began yelling into his phone, and Ethan, billionaire heir, once the crown prince of the Blake dynasty, stood in the wreckage of his picture-perfect wedding, heart in his throat, his entire life unraveling, thread by thread. He turned slowly and looked at Sabrina, who had torn her veil off and was glaring at him with the fury of a woman both humiliated and betrayed. She didn't need to say a word. Her slap landed before he even saw her move. Sharp, precise, echoing louder than the crash of shattered expectations around them. Then she walked out too, her heels stabbing the floor like gunshots. Victor stepped forward, furious. "You're throwing away everything." "For what? For her?" "For the truth," Ethan said. "And for my child." He ripped off the diamond-encrusted boutonniere his mother had insisted on pinning to his lapel that morning and let it fall to the floor. Then he walked out of the ballroom without another word. The city air outside was crisp, the buzz of traffic and distant sirens a soundtrack far more honest than the string quartet inside. The sky was pale and cloudless, mocking the storm unraveling beneath it. Boson didn't look back. He didn't know what Jasmine had meant exactly, or how Victor was involved, but he knew one thing with brutal certainty. He had to find her, and he had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost, because the past had just walked into his present. carrying his future. It was raining the day Ethan Blake met Jasmine Rivera. Not the soft, romantic kind of rain that made poets wax poetic about fate and umbrellas. No, this was the angry, sideways, Manhattan sort of rain that turned streets into rivers and soaked even the best-laid plans. Ethan had ducked into the NYU library to escape it, a leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder, his suit jacket clinging damply to his back. He wasn't supposed to be there. Harvard alums didn't usually wander into NYU libraries. But his meeting with a fintech startup CEO nearby had run long, and he needed a quiet place to review quarterly numbers and dry off before dinner. He found a secluded spot in the upper mezzanine, quiet, half-empty, smelling faintly of paper and lemon floor cleaner. He dropped into a creaky wooden chair across from an empty seat and pulled out his laptop. That was when she walked in. She was soaked, not just damp, soaked through. Her dark curls clung to her face in damp spirals, and her hoodie, emblazoned with a faded NYU economics logo, was dripping onto the tiled floor. She clutched a cracked, overstuffed backpack to her chest like it was a lifeline. "Is anyone sitting here?" she asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. Ethan looked up from his screen and blinked. She wasn't the type of woman who usually entered his carefully curated orbit. No sleek blowout, no Prada bag, no rehearsed smile. She was real, untamed, electric, and she was asking to sit at his table like she didn't know who he was. "No," he said, gesturing. "Be my guest." She offered a grateful smile, dropped into the chair and began unloading books, heavy tomes with cracked spines and multicolored tabs sticking out like feathers. One of them caught his eye, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. "Studying classical econ?" he asked before he could stop himself. She looked up at him, surprised. "More like poking holes in it. I'm writing a paper on why the invisible hand doesn't work in contemporary microcredit markets." His eyebrows shot up. "That's not something most people challenge. Adam Smith's considered the cornerstone of modern economics." "Cornerstones are meant to hold up buildings," she said dryly, "not ideologies that ignore the working poor." Ethan stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "I'm Ethan," he said, offering his hand. She hesitated, then took it. "Jasmine." "Jasmine Rivera?" She looked startled. "Yes?" He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You wrote that piece in the New York Policy Review about behavioral incentives in predatory lending. I quoted you in a panel at the Brookings Institute 2 months ago." Her eyes widened. "You're that Ethan Blake?" He grinned. "Guilty. I didn't realize rich guys from hedge funds read anything not printed on glossy prospectuses. I didn't realize policy students from Queens wrote better analysis than half my boardroom." She flushed, just slightly. "Well, I guess we're both full of surprises." That was how it started. What should have been a 5-minute encounter turned into a 2-hour conversation. They talked about the illusion of meritocracy, about the problem with GDP as a measure of human progress, about what it meant to build a life outside the expectations of where you came from. Jasmine's voice was like fire, sharp, passionate, unfiltered. Ethan, who spent most of his life wrapped in civility and expensive suits, felt a strange kind of spark ignite inside him. She challenged him, called him out, laughed when he tried to make dry finance jokes, and made him think twice about the systems he'd spent his life upholding. When the library closed, they walked outside together under one of those yellow-orange sodium streetlights, rain still misting around them. "Can I buy you a coffee?" he asked. Jasmine tilted her head. "You're still wearing a $5,000 watch. You don't strike me as a bodega coffee guy." Challenge accepted, he said with a grin. They ended up at a corner deli in the East Village with cracked linoleum floors and a broken neon sign. Jasmine ordered a black coffee and an egg sandwich. Ethan did the same. They sat by the window and talked until the sky turned silver. He didn't want the night to end. 3 days later, he texted her. A week after that, they were inseparable. For Ethan, it was like being dropped into an entirely different universe. Jasmine didn't care about his last name or his trust fund, or the fact that his stepfather had been on the cover of Forbes more times than he could count. She teased him for how much he spent on socks, introduced him to Dominican food that made his eyes water, and forced him to take the subway just to remind him that 99% of the world doesn't own a driver. He started skipping elite networking events to help her prep for exams. He visited her childhood home in Jackson Heights, met her mother who ran a daycare from the first floor, and played dominoes with her uncles on weekends. She, in turn, listened to his fears about never living up to his father's legacy, about being nothing more than Victor's puppet. With Jasmine, he felt like himself. Not Ethan Blake, golden boy of Wall Street, just Ethan. When he finally brought her to a charity gala, one hosted by his family's foundation, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. His mother, Helena Blake, was polite in the way a blade was polite before it cut. Later that night, Victor cornered him on the terrace. "She's smart," he said, sipping bourbon. "But Ethan, this is a phase. You don't marry someone who doesn't understand this world. She's from Queens. Her father's a mechanic, for God's sake." "She's brilliant," Ethan replied, jaw tight. "She's already published more original research than I have." Victor leaned in, voice low. "You don't build an empire with passion projects and idealism. You build it with alliances, leverage, name recognition. Sabrina Caldwell's father controls 5 regulatory boards. Jasmine Rivera controls, what, a classroom at NYU?" Ethan didn't speak. Victor's eyes narrowed. "You're young. Don't ruin everything with your heart." That was the last time Ethan ever took Victor's advice on love. He proposed 6 months later. It wasn't a grand spectacle. Just a quiet evening at her favorite rooftop spot in Brooklyn, 2 slices of pizza, and a single gold band he picked out himself. No family heirlooms, no publicists, no fanfare. Jasmine cried when she said yes. They were married in the spring, under a canopy of cherry blossoms in Central Park. Her family outnumbered his 3-1. His mother didn't attend. Victor sat stiffly in the back row, sunglasses hiding his expression. They didn't care. Their honeymoon was a road trip up the coast. No 5-star resorts, just motels, beaches, and gas station playlists. They sang badly, fought over directions, fell deeper in love. For a while, it was perfect. They rented a cozy brownstone in Harlem. Jasmine began teaching economics at a local community college while finishing her graduate research. Ethan stepped away from the family firm and launched a financial literacy nonprofit, something that shocked his friends and infuriated Victor. They had late-night discussions about starting a family. Jasmine wanted 3, Ethan wanted 2. They joked about adopting a 4th just to keep things interesting. And then they started trying. At first it was hopeful, exciting, full of dreams and baby name lists. But months passed, then a year. The joy dulled. The ovulation kits came out. The mood dimmed. Doctor visits turned into injections. Spontaneity became charts and calendars. Jasmine tried to stay positive. Ethan tried to stay strong. Nothing worked. Victor, surprisingly, offered to help. He knew people, had access to the best clinics, and insisted on covering the costs. Jasmine was skeptical, but Ethan, exhausted and desperate, agreed. The treatments began again, and again, and again. 3 failed IVF rounds. Jasmine's smile dimmed. Ethan's optimism cracked. They stopped talking about names. They started sleeping back to back. She cried in the bathroom more nights than he could count, and all he could do was wait behind the door. Useless. One night, after dinner, Jasmine stood at the kitchen sink, hands in soapy water, and whispered, "Maybe we're not supposed to be parents." He didn't know what to say. The silence between them became its own language. And then, without warning, it was over. No dramatic argument, no slammed doors, just a quiet conversation at midnight. "I love you," she had said, her voice shaking, "but I can't do this anymore. Not like this." He let her go. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. And now, 7 months later, there she was, standing in the ballroom of what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Pregnant, with his child, and suddenly everything he thought he knew about the past, about Jasmine, about himself, was no longer true. The morning sun filtered through gauzy curtains in their brownstone bedroom, catching flecks of dust in the golden light. Jasmine lay on her side, watching Ethan sleep, his back rising and falling in that rhythmic way she used to find comforting. Lately, though, it felt like the space between them had stretched wider than the Hudson River. She could reach out and touch him, but it would feel like knocking on a locked door. They had just passed their 3rd wedding anniversary. They had spent it in silence. There was no champagne, no dinner reservations, not even the celebratory takeout they once ordered while dancing barefoot in their kitchen. Instead, they exchanged tired glances and shared a half-hearted kiss that didn't reach the heart. Their once easy laughter had been replaced by carefully chosen words and heavy pauses. Everything now existed in the shadow of what they couldn't have. They had started trying for a baby the year before, with excitement and plans scrawled in journals. Jasmine bought books about conscious parenting, and Ethan downloaded every podcast on fertility optimization. It was all thrilling at first, but month after month passed, and so did the thrill. Hope turned to stress. Joy turned to pressure. They began tracking her cycle with scientific precision. Intimacy became a transaction on a schedule. When to try, when to wait, when to pray. Jasmine had always been comfortable in her body, confident even, but lately it had felt like a machine that refused to work. One morning, after the 5th negative test in 5 months, Jasmine sat on the bathroom floor, knees pulled to her chest, and wept silently while Ethan paced outside the door, helpless. They told themselves it was just bad timing. Stress. Lifestyle. Nothing serious. Until it was. The fertility specialist, Dr. Markham, was clinical but kind. After a battery of blood work, scans, and sperm counts, she sat them down and uttered the phrase that broke them both in half. Unexplained infertility. No reason, no solution, just a wall. You're both healthy, technically, Dr. Markham said, but sometimes the pieces don't align. I'd suggest starting with IVF. With your profiles, you have a reasonable chance. Jasmine's throat had tightened. Ethan squeezed her hand. She nodded. Reasonable chance was better than no chance. They agreed to start right away. What followed was an ordeal neither of them was ready for. Jasmine had known IVF was hard, but knowing and living it were worlds apart. The daily hormone injections made her nauseous and irritable. Her body bloated from water retention, and her emotions swerved like a car on black ice. She cried at everything: commercials, dog videos, the way Ethan stirred his coffee without speaking. And Ethan, he tried. God, he tried. He took notes during appointments, cooked dinner when she couldn't stand the smell of food, rubbed her back through hormone-induced cramps. But she could see it in his eyes, the fear, the fatigue, the frustration he never voiced. After their second failed cycle, Jasmine started spending more time at the university where she was teaching. Her lectures gave her structure, her students a distraction. She didn't want to come home to the silent house that reminded her of what was missing. Meanwhile, Ethan buried himself in work. He took on consulting contracts, pitched new social ventures, and stayed late at meetings that didn't need him. Anything to avoid the quiet ache waiting behind their front door. They rarely fought. Instead, they coexisted like ghosts. One night, Jasmine brought up adoption over dinner. Take out Ty, untouched. Her voice was cautious, almost embarrassed. "What if we started thinking about other options?" she said, pushing pad Thai around her plate. Ethan looked up slowly. "Like what?" "Adoption, maybe even fostering." He nodded, but his jaw was tight. "Yeah, sure, if that's what you want. But is it what you want?" The question hung in the air like fog. "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "I want us back. I miss us." "So do I." But nothing changed. It got worse after the third failed IVF round. They were at his stepfather's estate that weekend. Victor had invited them under the pretense of a family dinner. Jasmine hadn't wanted to go, but Ethan insisted. He thought it might distract them. Instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. Victor was in rare form that night. Sociable, charismatic, a host with charm weaponized for power. He'd invited half the board of Blake Capital and their wives, each of them parading their picture-perfect families like trophies. Jasmine sat stiffly at the long mahogany table, chewing through her filet mignon, her appetite long gone. Across from her, Victor's wife, an Upper East Side heiress with a decade of Botox behind her smile, asked if they had any baby news to share. Victor cut in before Jasmine could answer. "Still working on it," he said with a laugh that lacked any warmth. "But these things take time. After all, every woman wants to be a mother. It's nature's greatest joy." Jasmine's hand tightened around her wineglass. She felt Ethan stiffen beside her. Victor leaned forward, napkin dabbing his lips. "I was just telling Charlotte about Dr. Grayson, the fertility expert we used to recommend to some friends. Performed miracles. He's not cheap, but then again, what's money compared to continuing the family legacy?" Silence settled over the table like snow. Later that night, Jasmine locked herself in the guest bathroom and cried until her eyes swelled shut. When she emerged, Ethan was sitting on the bed, his hands twisted in his lap. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. He stood. "Do what?" "This. The appointments, the injections, the hope, the failure. Your stepfather treating me like a defective incubator. I'll talk to him." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" I don't think I can do us anymore." The words hit him like a punch. "What are you saying?" His voice cracked. "I think," she choked back a sob. "I think we want different things. Or maybe we want the same thing, but we can't get there. And I can't keep trying and feeling like I'm failing you." He crossed to her, reached for her hands, but she pulled back. "I've never blamed you," he whispered. "Not once." "You don't have to," she said. "I do enough of that for both of us." That night, they lay side by side in bed, without touching. Neither slept. By morning, the decision was made, though neither of them dared say the word divorce aloud. It lingered, unspoken, thick in the air like smoke from a fire neither could put out. Ethan moved into a hotel 2 weeks later. She didn't cry when he packed. Sure. She didn't cry when he left. She waited until the door clicked shut behind him, and then she fell to the floor and wept like the earth had opened beneath her. When the final paperwork arrived, Jasmine stared at her signature on the dotted line for a long time. She felt empty, like someone had carved out a piece of her and left only the shell. At their last meeting, just them and their lawyers. She looked at Ethan for a moment longer than she should have. His tie was crooked, his eyes were bloodshot. He looked like the version of herself she saw in the mirror every morning. "I hope you find happiness," she said softly, sliding the papers across the table. He stared down at them, unmoving. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I only ever found it with you." And still, they signed. And still they walked away. Neither of them could have known what was about to happen. That within weeks of the ink drying, Jasmine would wake up nauseous for 3 straight mornings. That she'd take a test out of habit, just to rule it out, and see 2 pink lines. That she'd be carrying the miracle they had stopped believing in. And that Ethan, broken, bound to a world that cared more for bloodlines than love, would be standing at another altar, promising a future to a woman he didn't truly know, while Jasmine stood in the shadows of the ballroom, carrying his child. Jasmine didn't even feel the cold that day. She just stood on the sidewalk outside Dr. Chen's office, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping the envelope that held the test results. Her breath fogged the glass door as she hesitated. Inside, the receptionist gave her a polite nod. Jasmine blinked, then stepped in, unsure how her legs were still moving. She was pregnant. Really pregnant. Not a maybe, not a faint line, not a chemical tease. This was real. Confirmed. 6 weeks. Heartbeat detected. Estimated due date circled in red ink on the printout, tucked inside her bag. And it made no sense. Not. For nearly 2 years, her body had failed her. Month after month, she had injected herself with hormones, bruised her thighs, charted her temperature like it was gospel. And nothing. Her womb had been declared inhospitable, her eggs sluggish, her odds slim to none. And now, 3 months after her divorce, when she wasn't trying, when she'd stopped believing, when she was eating carbs again and drinking coffee like it didn't matter, now her body decided to do the one thing it had never managed before. At first, she thought it was a cruel joke. Then, as the days passed, she found herself placing a hand over her belly more often, listening, waiting, hoping. It terrified her how quickly hope had returned, slipping through the cracks like sunlight through boarded windows. Still, the disbelief lingered. So, when Dr. Chen called her in for a follow-up, Jasmine pressed for more answers. "I know this can happen," she said, seated across from the doctor's pristine white coat and unreadable expression. "Spontaneous conception, mind-body balance, whatever. But it doesn't explain why, not after everything." Dr. Chen had looked uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "Normally," she said, folding her hands. "I wouldn't re-review a case post-discharge unless something flagged in our system, but in going over your prior treatments, something did catch my attention. Something that didn't sit right." Jasmine sat straighter. "What kind of something?" "Your medication logs." Dr. Chen reached for a folder, flipping it open with delicate precision. "Specifically, what you were administered during IVF." Jasmine frowned. "We followed everything exactly, every protocol, every dosage." Dr. Chen tapped a page. "Yes, except the compound administered wasn't what I prescribed. It was close, chemically similar, but notably less potent." A beat of silence passed. Jasmine didn't breathe. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Dr. Chen replied gently, "your treatment cycles were tampered with, substituted. Enough to appear compliant on paper, but insufficient to produce viable implantation. And those substitutions required approval from your financial guarantor." Jasmine's skin turned ice cold. "Victor Blake." She said his name aloud, and Dr. Chen didn't correct her, just gave a soft, non-committal nod. The implications crashed down all at once, like thunder following lightning. Jasmine didn't remember standing, didn't remember leaving the clinic. She only remembered the numbness, the way her heartbeat became deafening in her ears, her thoughts spinning with betrayal. She walked for hours, through Midtown, through the village, past the brownstone where she and Ethan had once lived. She stopped at a crosswalk and watched a little girl chase a leaf across the sidewalk, her mother laughing behind her. Jasmine's hands curled over her belly instinctively. Victor had always been cold, ambitious, ruthlessly polished, but never had she believed he would go so far as to sabotage her, to take away her motherhood, to lie. But it made sense now, the oddly timed check-ins, the generous offer to cover expenses, the way her treatments never progressed quite right. How he always seemed to know their progress, even when they didn't tell him. She should have seen it sooner. The pieces were there. The cold disdain in his eyes, the way he spoke about her family like they were parasites. He never wanted Ethan to stay married to her. She knew that. But to deliberately destroy their chances of a child, that was monstrous. And Ethan? Did he know? She couldn't answer that. A war ignited inside her chest. One part wanted to march straight to Blake Capital and drag Victor into the light. Another part wanted to run, vanish, raise the baby in peace, never look back. But then she thought of Ethan. She thought of his face the day they got their first negative, how he held her, arms trembling, how he never blamed her, even when it was easier to do so. He had his flaws, but he had loved her. That much was undeniable. He deserved to know, not just about the baby, but the truth. All of it. But telling him in private was a risk. Victor would bury it, twist it, silence it. Jasmine knew how that world worked. Secrets in that circle didn't just disappear. They were erased and rewritten. No. If she was going to expose this, it had to be public, unignorable. So she found a way. Through Maria. Her old college friend had been working in event staffing for years, and when Jasmine heard Victor's daughter was marrying Senator Caldwell's, she didn't have to ask. She knew the wedding would be public, lavish, tabloid-worthy. Victor wouldn't be able to resist turning it into a legacy moment. And Jasmine, She'd be the ghost in the gallery. "I can get you in," Maria had said, concerned. "But you're 4 months pregnant. Are you sure this is the best way?" "I need him to see me," Jasmine whispered. "And I need everyone else to see the truth." So she suited up. Black slacks, white shirt, no makeup, hair in a bun, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that screamed anything other than staff. Her heart thundered with every step through the service entrance of the Waldorf. She moved quietly through the catering hall, tray in hand, invisible. Just another hired hand. Until he saw her. Until everything fell apart. She hadn't expected the silence. Hadn't expected him to walk away from the altar. And when he reached her, those eyes she once loved, filled with disbelief and agony, she knew. He hadn't known. He hadn't been part of it. He had been betrayed too. And now? Now he knew the truth. But truth was just the beginning. There was still the matter of Victor. Jasmine didn't wait for a press release. She didn't rely on Ethan to confront his stepfather. She went back to Dr. Chen, filed a formal grievance, demanded an investigation. She began compiling the paper trail. Medication logs, receipts, authorizations, timestamps. She contacted her old colleague at the Times, off the record. Then a lawyer. Then another. The avalanche had started, and it was unstoppable. The fertility clinic launched a full internal audit. Dr. Chen supported her complaint. Anonymous staff confirmed that Victor had donated heavily, always with suggestions. And slowly the story began to take shape. The powerful financier who torpedoed his own grandchild's conception to preserve a social merger, the woman who uncovered it, the baby that defied the odds. Jasmine knew she was placing a target on her back. Victor wasn't going to go quietly. Men like him never did. But she didn't care. She wasn't scared anymore. Not of him. Not of the media. Not even of Ethan's reaction. Because whatever happened next, he knew the truth. That night, back in her small apartment in Harlem, she sat on the couch, one hand resting over her belly. "You're real," she whispered. "And they tried to stop you. But you're here anyway." The baby kicked for the first time. It felt like fireworks in her abdomen, tiny and powerful. Jasmine laughed, tears welling in her eyes. "You're a fighter," she whispered, "just like your mom." And just like that, she knew. Victor might have played God with test tubes and signatures, but he had lost. The one thing he feared the most, his empire unraveling from the inside, had already begun. And Jasmine Rivera? She was no longer the outsider. She was the storm. Rain tapped against the windows of Ethan's hotel suite, a soft rhythm that mirrored the chaos inside his mind. The silence between the walls was unbearable, too clean, too polished. It wasn't home. It never would be. Not without her. 3 days had passed since the wedding that didn't happen. The news had exploded across every media outlet in Manhattan. Billionaire Ethan Blake's wedding derailed by pregnant ex-wife turned whistleblower. The gossip pages had a field day. "Secrets, scandals, and sabotage," one headline blared. "The unmaking of a dynasty," screamed another. Ethan didn't read most of them. What he did read were Jasmine's words, over and over, echoing in his head. "The baby is yours, Ethan." That one sentence unraveled the last few years of his life like a spool of silk thread cut loose. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about the look on her face, the defiance, the heartbreak, the fierce love for the child she carried. His child. Their child. A child he believed he could never have. He still couldn't believe it. Not completely. But Jasmine wasn't the type to lie, not about something like this, and the horror in Victor's eyes when she exposed the truth said more than words ever could. Victor. Ethan clenched his fists. The betrayal burned in him like acid. He had defended that man, defied Jasmine in his name, trusted him, and the whole time Victor had been pulling the strings, sabotaging their marriage, controlling their future, manipulating their lives with surgical precision, as if Ethan was nothing more than a pawn in his grand social blueprint. And now Ethan had nothing. No wife, no wedding, no answers. He picked up his phone and stared at Jasmine's name in his contacts. His thumb hovered over it for a long time before he pressed call. The line rang once, twice. She picked up on the third. Her voice was cautious, firm. Ethan? He took a breath. Thank you for picking up. I didn't know what to say until now. I'm still not sure I do. You don't have to say anything, she said, her tone neutral. The truth said enough. I need to see you. A pause. Then, tomorrow, 1 o'clock, somewhere public. They met at a quiet cafe in the East Village, tucked between a used bookstore and an old record shop. Ethan arrived early. He watched the door like a soldier waiting for a ceasefire. When Jasmine walked in, he stood. She was wearing a navy coat and a scarf looped around her neck. Her belly was more prominent than he remembered, visible even under the layers, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were guarded, tired, but clear. She sat across from him. They didn't speak at first. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. You look beautiful. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. Let's not. Okay, he said softly. Let's talk about the baby then. She nodded, placing both hands protectively on her bump. I'm 22 weeks, due in July. It's a boy. His breath caught. A boy. She studied his reaction closely. I wasn't going to tell you. Not until I knew what Victor did. I didn't want to risk him spinning it. I didn't know if you'd believe me. I would have, Ethan said instantly. Then, after a beat, I think. God, Jasmine, I didn't even think something like this was possible. We thought we tried everything. You didn't know he was controlling it. I should have. I should have seen it. Jasmine's voice softened. You trusted him. I did too, once. They ordered coffee, though neither of them touched it. What do you want from me, Jasmine? Ethan asked finally. I'm not asking in anger. I need to know where I stand. Jasmine exhaled, eyes flicking to the window before meeting his again. I want you to know your son. If you want to. I'm not here to drag you into something unwillingly, but I'm not hiding him either. He's yours, whether we're together or not. He nodded, emotion swelling in his throat. I want to be there, for every ultrasound, every appointment, every late-night craving. I missed too much already. Then be there, she said simply. But it's not about making up for the past, Ethan. It's about showing up now. I will. Jasmine stared at him a moment longer, then finally reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. What's this? He asked. Proof, she said. Medical records, treatment logs, authorization forms with Victor's signature. I'm filing a formal complaint with the state licensing board, and I'm suing the clinic. I thought you should know. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly, seeing his stepfather's signature. So familiar, so deliberate, on a document authorizing a medication substitution for his wife, felt like swallowing glass. "He'll try to bury this," he said. "He'll spin it, paint you as hysterical, vindictive." "Can try," Jasmine replied, "but I'm not scared of him anymore." Ethan looked up. "He should be scared of you." That night, Ethan met with Richard Hale, the attorney who had once handled his trust account. Hale, in his late 50s, with a silver beard and a dry sense of humor, listened carefully as Ethan outlined the sabotage. When he was done, Hale leaned back and whistled. "You understand what this means, right? This wasn't just unethical. It's criminal." "I want to press charges," Ethan said. "I'll get started," Hale replied, "but you should also know there's something else." He slid a file across the desk. "Victor didn't just sabotage your personal life. He's been quietly moving assets, shifting board alliances. Blake Capital's future? He's trying to cut you out entirely." Ethan's chest went tight. "How?" "He's pitching a restructure that puts him as sole executive chair. He's claiming you're distracted, erratic, unstable. After the wedding scandal." "That bastard," Ethan muttered. "He's been preparing this for a while. You were never supposed to know." Ethan leaned forward, fire igniting in his voice. "Then he doesn't know me at all." Over the next several weeks, Ethan made his move. He subpoenaed the fertility clinic for records. He presented the evidence to the state attorney general's office. And he called a private shareholders meeting. Victor arrived at that meeting confident, tailored in navy and arrogance. But when Ethan stepped onto the floor, backed by two of the firm's oldest board members and Hale flanking his side, the tides shifted. "I have proof," Ethan said, voice steady, calm, lethal, "that Victor Blake sabotaged the fertility treatments of my wife, now ex-wife, for the purpose of ending our marriage and preserving a merger between elite families. I have sworn statements from medical professionals, documentation of substitution, and evidence of coercion." Murmurs rippled through the room. Victor stood, his voice cool. "This is personal speculation, not board business." Ethan met his gaze. "It became board business the moment you jeopardized a senior partner's well-being to advance your own agenda." Silence followed. Then one board member, an old friend of Ethan's father, spoke up. "We moved to suspend Victor Blake from executive authority pending a formal ethics investigation." A unanimous vote. Victor's expression cracked, just for a moment. Enough for Ethan to see the fury behind his eyes, but the damage was done. The empire Victor had built on secrecy had just crumbled under the weight of the truth. Later that night, Ethan walked up the steps of Jasmine's apartment building, a bag of takeout in hand. He rang the bell and waited, nerves crawling under his skin. When she opened the door, she looked surprised, but not unhappy. "I come bearing gifts," he said, holding up the bag. "Thai food, the kind you like, and a promise." She raised an eyebrow. "What kind of promise?" Ethan stepped inside, set the bag down, and turned to face her fully. "That I'm all in. Not just for the baby. For you. For us. If you'll let me try." Jasmine looked at him, eyes searching. "It's not going to be easy. I know. You broke my heart. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand and placed it gently on her belly. The baby kicked. Ethan's breath caught. Jasmine's voice trembled as she said, "He's been waiting to meet you." Ethan knelt, pressing his forehead against her bump. His eyes closed. Tears slid silently down his cheeks. "I'll never leave again," he whispered. "I swear it." Spring arrived in Manhattan with a kind of restless bloom, as if the city itself was exhaling after a long, bitter season. Ethan stood in the waiting room of Mount Sinai West, eyes fixed on the door to exam room 3, his thumb pressed anxiously into the palm of his hand as he counted down the seconds. Jasmine was inside. So was their son. He hadn't missed a single appointment since that first one, where he saw the flutter of a heartbeat on the monitor and had to blink hard to hold it together. Now, as they neared the 3rd trimester, he could recognize the outline of his son's spine, the way he kicked like he was already fighting something. The nurse finally cracked the door open and gave Ethan a quick wave. "You can come in now." He exhaled in relief and pushed into the room. Jasmine was reclined on the exam table, belly exposed beneath a thin blue sheet, her fingers resting gently on her side. The technician was mid-swipe with the ultrasound wand, and the monitor beside them glowed with motion. Tiny limbs, a rolling spine, a strong, steady pulse. "Hey," she said softly when she saw him. Ethan smiled and kissed her temple. "Hey, how's our little ninja doing today?" "Ready to break dance," she murmured. "He hasn't stopped moving all morning." The technician chuckled. "Active baby is a good sign. Everything looks strong, weight is on track, placenta position's perfect. He's head down now, too." Ethan stared at the monitor like it held a sacred map. His son's profile appeared. Round nose, open mouth, tiny fist grazing his cheek, and his chest tightened. "You see in this?" he whispered. Jasmine nodded, her voice shaky. "I see him." She didn't need to say more. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Of memory, of grief, of miracle. There had been too many nights when they thought this would never happen. Too many cycles, too many tears. And now, somehow, despite everything, they were here. When the appointment ended, Ethan helped Jasmine sit up and slipped her coat gently over her shoulders. "Want to walk a bit before we go home?" She nodded, and they strolled slowly down Central Park West, her arm looped in his, the air brisk but forgiving. Dog walkers, tourists, and stroller-pushing moms passed them in every direction, but they walked in a world of their own. Jasmine broke the silence first. "I got a call from the Atlantic. They want to run a feature story on the case. Investigative piece on reproductive ethics and wealth interference." Ethan grimaced. "You want to do it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to move on. The other part thinks, maybe it matters. Maybe our story could protect someone else." He nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'll back you." They walked a little farther, then Jasmine stopped and turned toward him. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Do you ever hate her?" He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "I did," Ethan said. "For a long time. After my dad died, I thought Victor was saving us. But looking back, she controlled every detail of my life. Where I went to school, who I dated, what I read, what I wore to breakfast. Jasmine? She chose my college roommates. I didn't even know until 2 years ago." Jasmine shook her head in disbelief. "I think she convinced herself it was love," Ethan continued, "that she was protecting me from weakness. But I don't think she ever understood love doesn't survive on manipulation. It can't." She watched him carefully. "So, do you still hate her?" Ethan let out a slow breath. "No, I just don't carry her with me anymore." Jasmine didn't respond right away, but she reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his as they continued walking, and the unspoken understanding between them was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of nesting and strategy. Ethan was officially reinstated as co-chairman of Blake Capital pending a final board decision in the summer. Jasmine filed her legal action against the clinic and the civil suit against Victor. Public sentiment was on their side, thanks in no small part to the blog post she published, raw and honest, titled, "The Baby They Said I'd Never Have." It went viral. Within 48 hours, she had interview requests from 5 major networks and 1,000 DMs from women who said her words gave them courage. Ethan watched her work with quiet admiration, understanding now more than ever that Jasmine was not just the woman he loved. She was a force. But for all the triumphs, there were setbacks too. Victor had hired a brutal PR firm, and they launched a counter-campaign, calling Jasmine's lawsuit a misunderstanding, claiming the substitution was a clerical error, downplaying the extent of his control. His legal team filed a countersuit for defamation. "What a snake," Jasmine muttered one night, scrolling through the press release. "He's scared," Ethan said. "He's finally losing control." Still, the stress was mounting. The pressure, the media frenzy, the looming birth, the civil litigation. It felt like a storm pressing in from all directions. So Ethan made a decision. They needed to breathe. He took Jasmine upstate for a weekend. They found a little cabin near Lake Placid, tucked beneath a canopy of budding trees and wildflowers. There was no reception, no paparazzi, no reminders of court dates or headlines. Just them. The sound of birdsong in the morning, a warm fire at night. On their second evening, Jasmine curled up beside him on the worn leather couch, her head resting on his shoulder, her belly pressing into his side. "You remember our first anniversary?" she asked sleepily. Ethan smiled. "The one where we got stuck in that roadside motel because your conference got snowed in? I was so mad at first," she said with a laugh, "and then we ended up playing board games with those old Canadian hikers until 2 a.m. And they made us that awful stew with the elk meat." They both laughed, and the sound filled the cabin like music. "I miss us," Jasmine said softly. "I mean, I love where we're going. But I miss who we were." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "I think we're still us, just different now. Stronger, wiser. With more stretch marks and legal bills." She smiled. "And a baby." "Yeah," he said, his voice catching. "And a baby." They didn't say much after that. Just sat together, listening to the wind whistle across the lake. When they returned to the city, it was with renewed clarity. Jasmine began working with a pro bono legal team that specialized in medical ethics. Ethan met with key board members to propose a transparency clause for executive family involvement in personal medical decisions, nicknamed the Rivera Clause by one of the directors. And then, just like that, it was June. Jasmine's due date crept closer, and so did her nerves. Ethan became her anchor, massaging her swollen feet each night, reading aloud from baby books, even assembling a crib at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. "You think he'll like us?" Jasmine asked one night, lying on her side, voice trembling with vulnerability. "I think he already does," Ethan whispered, resting a hand on her belly. The baby kicked in response. They both froze, then broke into tears. That weekend, Jasmine's friends threw her a baby shower at a rooftop loft overlooking the skyline. She wore a white dress with embroidered stars and let herself laugh, really laugh, for the first time in months. Ethan came by late, just in time for the last toast. She didn't want gifts, Maria told the crowd, so we all donated to a new scholarship fund for women pursuing reproductive justice degrees. In her name. Jasmine blinked, stunned. Maria raised her glass. To Jasmine Rivera, and the baby who changed everything. That night, Jasmine stood in the nursery, soft blue walls, watercolor animal prints, shelves filled with storybooks, and touched the edge of the crib. "We're ready," she whispered. "Come when you're ready, little one. We'll be here." She didn't know then how close that moment was. The next day, her water broke, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jasmine gripped Ethan's hand with a force that rivaled anything he'd felt in his life. Not a firm squeeze, not a gentle plea for comfort, but a visceral, instinctive hold like she was tethering herself to something solid in a world spinning off its axis. I can't," she gasped, her head dropping back against the hospital bed as another contraction crested through her body like a crashing wave. "You can," Ethan said, brushing the damp curls from her forehead. "You are. Just breathe with me, Jazz. Right here. Look at me." She blinked up at him, her eyes wild with pain and adrenaline, and for a second he saw the girl he'd met in the economics library, the woman who challenged the rules of the world and dared it to meet her halfway. Now here she was, delivering a baby nearly 3 weeks early, fighting through it like a warrior in battle. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. They were supposed to have more time, more planning, more sleep, more control. But the baby had other ideas. "Cervix is at 9 centimeters, the nurse said, glancing at the monitor. "We're almost there." "Almost there," Jasmine whispered, teeth clenched. "He's coming. He's really coming." Ethan nodded, his voice thick. "We're gonna meet him. We're finally going to meet him." It had started at 4:17 a.m., with what Jasmine thought was a back spasm. Then another, 8 minutes later. Then 5. By 6 a.m., they were on the FDR drive, with Ethan's knuckles white on the steering wheel and Jasmine breathing like she was trying to blow out a hurricane. They barely made it to Mount Sinai before her water broke in the hospital parking lot. There had been no time for long playlists or essential oils, no serene breathing techniques they'd learned in Lamaze. Just adrenaline, chaos, and a fierce urgency that made every second feel like it mattered more than the one before. Now, hours later, the room was filled with focused chaos. Nurses moved like a coordinated dance troupe. The OB, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Lynn, stood between Jasmine's knees, giving short, efficient commands. "On your next push, Jasmine," Dr. Lynn said, "we're going to crown. You got this." Jasmine shook her head. "I'm scared." "I know," Ethan said, bringing his forehead to hers. "But you're not alone." The next contraction tore through her with the ferocity of a breaking wave, and she pushed with everything inside her. Body, soul, heartbreak, hope, all of it channeled into that single motion. Then, "Shoulders clear," Dr. Lynn said. "One more small push. There. You did it." A sharp, wet cry pierced the room, and the world changed. Everything changed. The air itself felt different. Dr. Lynn lifted their son into the air and placed him gently on Jasmine's chest. Jasmine stared down at the squalling, slippery little miracle, her arms instinctively cradling him. "Hi," she whispered, as tears ran unchecked down her cheeks. "Hi, my baby." Ethan stood frozen for a moment, unable to breathe. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in dreams, in silent prayers he was too proud to say aloud, but nothing compared to reality. His son was here, real, warm, perfect. He leaned down, kissing Jasmine's forehead, then the top of their baby's head, and finally whispered, "Thank you." They named him Luca River Blake, a nod to her heritage and his legacy, and a reminder that life finds a way through even the hardest terrain. The hours that followed blurred into moments of whispered awe and quiet tears. Jasmine held Luca as nurses cleaned and measured him. Ethan helped swaddle him and watched with trembling hands as they examined his breathing, his oxygen, his vitals. 33 weeks, the pediatrician said. "But he's strong. We'll keep him in the NICU for a few days for observation, but he's breathing on his own. Good color, good tone. This is a good outcome." Those words, a good outcome, felt like a miracle in themselves. By that night, Jasmine was asleep in the recovery room, exhausted but peaceful, her hand resting on the spot where Luca had lived for so long. Ethan stood at the nursery window, watching his son sleep beneath the soft blue glow of an incubator lamp. The tiny hospital bracelet around Luca's ankle read, "Blake, Luca R. 6Ls, 2 Oz 18 inches, 11:24 a.m. It felt unreal. Ethan placed a hand against the glass. "I will never let you feel unloved," he whispered, "not for 1 second. I don't care about the business or the headlines or legacy. None of it matters without you and your mom." The glass was cool beneath his fingertips, but his heart had never been warmer. The next morning brought a different kind of call. Ethan was just finishing changing into fresh clothes when his phone rang. It was Richard Hale. "She's gone," Richard said. Ethan blinked. "What?" "Victoria passed this morning, in her sleep. Her nurse found her just after sunrise." The words landed like weights in his chest. Victor's wife. The woman who had orchestrated half of his childhood birthday parties, who had taught him how to tie a bow tie, who once baked him a cake when his own mother forgot. She had stayed silent during the scandal, said nothing in public, but she had sent Jasmine a handwritten note the week of the hearing. "I believe you, I always did." Now she was gone. Another piece of the past, another thread cut. "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "For what it's worth, she was the best of them." "She wanted you to have this," Richard said. "Left instructions, it's a key, to Victor's private office in the Hamptons. She said, there's something you need to see." Jasmine was still resting when Ethan drove up the next day, the coastline muted beneath a cloudy sky. The house was empty, quiet, full of ghosts. He found the office easily. It was locked, but the key turned without resistance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cigars and cedar. There were ledgers on the desk, folders, and an old wooden box labeled Estate Provisions. Inside the box was a manila envelope marked Confidential for Ethan Blake. He opened it slowly. Inside was a DNA test. His name, Jasmine's, and Luca's, dated 1 week before the wedding. Ethan's hands shook as he read the next page. A handwritten letter in Victor's perfect script. Ethan, by now, the truth has found you. Maybe you hate me. You should. I destroyed your family to protect what I thought mattered: lineage, reputation, stability. But the truth is, I knew from the moment Jasmine looked me in the eye and told me she'd never stop fighting, I had lost. Your son is yours. More yours than anything I ever gave you, and I suspect he will make you a better man than I ever was. Take care of him. Take care of her. You were always meant to choose love. I just didn't let you. Victor. Ethan sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. By the time he returned to the city, Jasmine was awake, holding Luca in the soft twilight of the hospital room. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face. "What happened?" she asked, instantly alert. Ethan crossed the room and knelt beside her. He placed the letter in her lap. "I think Victor tried to say goodbye." She read it silently, then looked at him, her eyes wide with tears. "You okay?" she whispered. He reached for her hand and placed it over Luca's chest, where the baby's tiny heartbeat thumped steady and strong. "I am now," Ethan said. "We are." Later that night, when the nurses took Luca back to the NICU for observation, Ethan climbed into the hospital bed beside Jasmine. She didn't say anything, just tucked herself into his chest and exhaled, like she had finally let go of something. They lay in the quiet hum of machines and dim lights. "You know," Jasmine whispered, "I think he's going to change everything." Ethan kissed her forehead. "He already has." The first time they brought Luca home, it felt like walking into a new dimension, one where every sound, every light, every movement suddenly carried weight. The taxi from Mount Sinai rolled up to their brownstone in the soft blush of a late summer afternoon. Jasmine, still tender from the birth and recovery, cradled Luca against her chest, while Ethan carried their hospital bags with the wide-eyed caution of a man transporting live gold. They stood in front of the door for a full 30 seconds, not speaking, just breathing. "You ready?" he asked, voice hushed, like they were about to enter a sacred temple. Jasmine looked down at Luca's sleeping face and whispered, "I think so." Inside, the brownstone was quiet. The nursery, once just an idea, now cradled real purpose. The air smelled of lavender and fresh paint. The mobile spun slowly above the crib, casting shifting shadows on the wall, paper stars and soft moons in motion. They didn't put him down for an hour. Luca stayed curled against Jasmine's chest, while Ethan sat beside them on the glider, his arm around her shoulders, his fingers resting gently on Luca's tiny back. The world could wait. Eventually, Jasmine laid him down in the crib, both of them holding their breath like it might break the spell. But Luca didn't cry. He slept. And for the first time in what felt like years, Jasmine and Ethan sat across from each other in their own kitchen, 2 mugs of tea between them, the weight of survival lifting, inch. "I feel like I've been holding my breath since the wedding," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," Ethan admitted. "But it's over now. We're safe." It wasn't a promise, just a hope. Because the truth was, even with Victor gone and the lawsuits behind them, the world still had sharp edges. The media hadn't fully moved on. There were still whispers, still reporters camped outside Blake Capital offices, still tabloid speculation about the future of the company and Ethan's place in it. Jasmine had received 2 more offers to write a book, and one to turn her story into a docuseries. She'd declined them all. For now. Right now, she was focused on learning Luca's rhythms. His hungry cry, his gassy cry, the little squeaky inhale he made when startled. Ethan handled the midnight diaper changes like a man on a mission, determined not to let Jasmine go it alone. They moved through the sleepless weeks like soldiers in a trench, exhausted, bleary-eyed, but bonded tighter than ever. And then, slowly, they started to breathe again. 3 months after Luca's birth, Ethan stood before the Blake Capital board with a proposal that stunned the room. "Effective immediately," he said, "I will be stepping down as interim CEO. We'll begin the process of appointing a permanent replacement, chosen not by family name or legacy, but by merit." The boardroom fell into stunned silence. "Blake Capital needs to evolve," he continued. "We've built this company on legacy for a century, but legacy without integrity is just a story we tell ourselves, and I don't want to lead a story. I want to build something real." "Who do you suggest replace you?" one of the older members asked. Ethan looked across the table at Morgan Hayes, the CFO, a woman with 2 master's degrees, 20 years of experience, and a reputation for sharp ethics and fierce loyalty. "I nominate Morgan," he said. "She's earned it." The board voted. She was confirmed in less than an hour. After the meeting, Ethan walked out of the building and didn't look back. He found Jasmine sitting in the park with Luca, a sketch pad in her lap. Luca bundled against the early November wind in a tiny bear-shaped hoodie. She smiled when she saw him. "How'd it go?" "I'm officially unemployed," he said. "Unemployed and free." He sat beside her, kissing Luca's forehead and stealing her glove to warm his hands. "You think I'm crazy?" "I think you're brave." Jasmine had returned to teaching part-time at NYU, focusing on a seminar called Power, Policy, and Reproductive Autonomy. Her class was already over-enrolled, and her inbox overflowed with emails from students, thanking her for giving voice to something they didn't know how to articulate. At night, after Luca went to sleep, she drafted articles, wrote grant proposals, and built a foundation. Literally, they named it the Luca Foundation. Its mission? To fund reproductive rights education and policy change, especially for women in marginalized communities. "I've been thinking," Ethan said one evening as they sat beside the fireplace, Luca asleep between them in a wrap carrier, "about Blake Capital, about the kind of impact it could still have if it wasn't tethered to the past." Jasmine looked at him. "You want to start something new?" "Not even a financial firm," he said. "Something more like an incubator for ethical entrepreneurship, for startups focused on healthcare transparency, women's rights, ethical AI, climate justice. You're talking about a full ecosystem." Ethan smiled. "Exactly. Seed funding, mentorship, ethical oversight, all under one roof. A place where the next generation of leaders builds with purpose, not profit as the only metric." Jasmine leaned over and kissed him. "Let's do it." They called it Clarity Ventures. By Luca's first birthday, the foundation had launched 2 startup partnerships, and Jasmine had published her first academic paper since returning to campus, an in-depth study on financial coercion in the fertility industry. She testified in front of a congressional subcommittee, standing beside medical professionals and other women whose lives had been shaped by unethical interference. Ethan stood in the back of the room, holding Luca, who was wearing a little navy cardigan and chewing on a stuffed giraffe. Every time Jasmine looked up and met their eyes, she smiled just a little wider. Afterward, she found them on the steps outside the Capitol. "I was nervous," she said, breathless. "You looked like a queen," Ethan replied. That night, back in their hotel suite, Jasmine sat by the window while Ethan rocked Luca to sleep. The moon cast a pale glow across the floor, and for a moment the world felt still. "I want to write a book," she said, almost to herself. "But not just about what happened. About everything. About how easy it is to lose your voice when the world insists it knows what's best for you. About how we get it back." Ethan smiled. "You already have." When the book was released a year later, it climbed to the top of the nonfiction bestseller list within 2 weeks. The voice they tried to silence was not just a memoir. It was a manifesto. Reviews called it raw, brilliant, and quietly revolutionary. Jasmine's TED Talk, delivered in jeans and a nursing bra with Luca babbling on her lap, went viral within 24 hours. The world had finally caught up with the fire she'd always carried. They bought a small house in Cold Spring a few months later, away from the city noise but close enough to return when the pulse called. The house had an overgrown garden, wide windows, and a sunroom that became Jasmine's writing space. Luca loved it. He ran barefoot through the grass every morning, his laughter echoing off the trees, his curls wild, his cheeks dimpled with joy. He called Ethan Dada and Jasmine Mama, and he greeted the sunrise every morning with a cheerful declaration of, "Hi, son." They took nothing for granted. Not a single moment. Even on hard days, when Jasmine was overwhelmed, or when Ethan felt the weight of everything he'd once inherited, they reminded each other of what they had built from the ashes. One night, as Luca slept in his toddler bed beneath a glow-in-the-dark solar system, Ethan and Jasmine sat outside on the porch swing, the summer air thick with the smell of honeysuckle and the soft buzz of cicadas. "You know," Jasmine murmured, her head resting on his shoulder, "if you had told me 5 years ago that this would be our life, I would have laughed in your face." "Same," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "Back then I thought I knew what success looked like. Suits, boards, power. And now?" He looked up at the stars. "Success is hearing Luca giggle in the bath. It's watching you speak truth into rooms that used to be locked. It's this swing, this night. You?" Jasmine looked at him, eyes shining. "Same." The swing creaked as they rocked. The wind whispered through the trees. And in that quiet, their journey settled around them, not as a fairy tale or a perfect ending, but as a real and honest life forged from truth, pain, love, and defiance. They had rewritten their legacy, and it belonged to them and to no one else. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means you connected with the journey of Jasmine, Ethan, and baby Luca, and we are truly honored to share that with you. This story wasn't just about betrayal, heartbreak, or redemption. It was about resilience, the power of love when everything else falls apart, and the strength it takes to choose what's right over what's easy. It reminds us that legacy isn't something we inherit. It's something we build, moment by moment, with every courageous choice we make. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if you found this story moving or meaningful in any way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories coming, true stories, powerful stories, that will stay with you long after the video ends. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, the life you're meant to live might be waiting just beyond your next brave decision.